Hi, this is Doug Renstrom with ROI Training. In programming, automation is the key to getting things done quicker and more reliably. In this video, I will show you how easy it is to automate your Kubernetes deployments. Let's switch to the demo machine.
Okay, this is demo 7 of 8 in our series on deploying applications to Kubernetes clusters. Let's talk a little bit about automation. As we've seen, Kubernetes is a pretty automated framework. With some simple commands, we can deploy our applications to our cluster. But let me give you a couple tips on automating everything. First of all, you can't automate anything that you can't do by hand. And if you notice in my demos, there have been many cases where I was typing in Docker commands and kubectl commands and so on. Now, these commands can be pretty hard to remember once you've learned them. So my first tip for you is every time you create a microservice, one of the first files within the folder you should create is a little cheat sheet. I always create a cheat sheet, and in that cheat sheet, as I'm learning the commands that I need for my particular application, I keep pasting those commands into it. That way I don't have to keep researching for the right command over and over again. I don't have to keep fiddling with parameters over and over again. And also, when I move from one microservice to another microservice, my cheat sheets have a lot of the same commands inside them. So again, and if you notice, like since I'm using Kubernetes, a lot of my commands are really focused around either the Docker CLI, like Docker build and Docker run and Docker stop and Docker push and Docker pull and Docker login and Docker PS and Docker RM and Docker RMI. Those are the Docker commands that I need to know in order to understand how to use Docker. So I guess you do have to do a little bit of learning for those commands. Those commands are pretty well documented. So there's a web page which lists all the Docker commands and how they're used and the parameters for those commands. We'll put a link to this web page below the video. But anyway, learn your Docker commands, step number 1. And then again, you don't want to have to relearn them over and over again. So put them in your cheat sheet as you're building your applications. And then the other CLI that I need to understand is the Kubernetes CLI, kubectl. Again, that is pretty well documented, and we'll give you a link to the command reference as well. But understand there aren't that many kubectl commands that you need to know. So what do you need? We've seen like all those kubectl get commands, get nodes, get pods, get services. The create commands, create deployment, create jobs. So again, in that reference, you'll see examples of using those. The expose command and the apply command and the delete command. Those are the main ones. And again, keep them in your cheat sheet or steal my cheat sheet from my GitHub repository and adapt it to your particular application. But if you know those two CLIs, Docker and kubectl, and you know a little bit about shell scripting, then some of this automation code can become pretty simple. And so if we look in my automation folder here, there are just a few simple scripts that I've written that help me out. So when I'm doing development, notice this command, redeploy all. What this does for me is it rebuilds all my Docker containers and reloads all those Docker containers, or re-pushes them up to Docker Hub and then reapplies them into my Kubernetes cluster. So, you know, in a typical developer workflow, I'm editing my code and I'm testing it on my developer machine. But at some point in time, I want to deploy everything to my Kubernetes cluster. And when I want to redeploy everything to the cluster, all I got to do is recall that script. And that script only takes a minute or less to run. And now everything's deployed to my Minikube cluster where I can test it from there. So again, it's not, once we understand those few simple commands, Notice there's no complex if statements or loops or grep commands in these shell scripts. It's all very simple and straightforward. I also wrote a command, or I also wrote a script to set everything up. So we've seen this run earlier in the course. If I want to deploy my application into a Kubernetes cluster, then it's just these few lines of code. Use Helm to install the database. That's all very automated for you. And then apply all my configuration. And and again, we've seen how that works. Most of that work is all happened already inside the Kubernetes configuration. Again, Kubernetes is a very automated framework. That's the way it's designed, so it makes your automation easier. And then similarly, I have an uninstall command as well. Well, I want to be able to redeploy everything, rebuild the containers, push them all into Docker Hub. Sometimes I don't want to do that. Sometimes I just want to, deploy everything to a cluster and see if it works from there. And sometimes I want to get rid of everything in the cluster as well. So no, it's just some simple shell scripts combined with some relatively simple Docker commands and Kubernetes commands, and we have a pretty automated framework. Anyway, take a look at those in my GitHub repository and try to reproduce that in your own applications. This is Doug Renstrom with ROI Training. Make sure you come back for our last video on deploying applications with Kubernetes.